This week on Afterwards, James Yee, author of For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire, describes his experience as an Army Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. 4 years ago, the military base began holding captured enemy combatants detained during the War on Terror. He explains, and the events that led to his arrest and imprisonment on charges that he was a national security risk. He's interviewed by Rowan Scarbourgh, defense correspondent for the Washington Times, who broke the story in the newspaper on September 20th, 2003.
James Yee, you begin your book with your sudden arrest in September of 2003. You find yourself a West Point graduate, the chaplain at Guantanamo Bay, the product of an all-American family, a military family, sitting in a brig in Charleston, South Carolina, accused of being a traitor, essentially, accused of being a spy. In the end, those charges are never officially brought, but you are accused of adultery and then mishandling classified information. But in the end, those charges go away too. The Army apparently cannot prove them, and so your time in prison, all the allegations are for naught, and the Army allows you to be honorably discharged. Have you come to a conclusion 2 years later, 3 years later, why the Army did this to you?
Oh, great question on whether or not I've come to a conclusion about why the Army's had done this to me. But you pointed out a number of initial things. Yes, I'm a West Point graduate. I come from a family that's deeply rooted in the military. My younger brother's a West Point graduate. My other younger brother is currently an Army doctor serving on active duty. My father was drafted during World War II. And I'm a third-generation Chinese American. I'm the son I'm a grandson of immigrants. Not an immigrant, not a son of immigrants, but a grandson of immigrants. So my family's been here for a long time. And you know, you asked whether or not I've come to a conclusion about why all this has happened. And you know, interestingly enough, I subtitled the book Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. And I'm making a statement here that my faith was under fire. The fact that I'm a Muslim American, that made me a suspect. That caused some suspicion in some individuals within the ranks and within the federal agencies that were down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The point that when I pray in the Islamic form of prayer, when I bow and prostrate, this mirrored the way the prisoners down in Guantanamo prayed, because they're all Muslim. They prayed in the same manner of bowing and prostrating. When I read the Quran in the classical Arabic language, along with the other American Muslims, the other patriotic American Muslims who were and are serving that joint task force mission, when they read the Quran along with me in the classical Arabic language, this also mirrored how the prisoners read the Quran in the classical Arabic language. And to some, as I said, within the ranks, that meant that we were also the enemy, so we became a target of suspicion. But also I'm saying that my patriotism was under fire. The fact that I was sent down to Guantanamo as a chaplain in a humanitarian role, not only to advocate for diversity and religious freedom and tolerance, fundamental American values, but also, according to the standard operating procedures, to provide observation and recommendations to the command about prisoner treatment. So I was also there as an advocate of humane treatment. And that also put me in the crosshairs and said to some that I was the enemy.
So you believe maybe the Army began to identify you as one of the detainees or an ally of the detainees. And then that's when their suspicion became unfounded. That's when their suspicion became reality to them.
They began to identify me mainly because of my faith and because of my patriotism. But you know, I'll also throw in that my ethnicity also played a role, because I was to later find out from a battalion commander who I quoted in the book from an email that he would write me, that someone had said of me, you know, who the hell does this Chinese Taliban think he is, telling us how to treat our prisoners? So the fact that my Chinese ethnicity was brought out also told me that that played a role in me being targeted, and then of course telling us how to treat our prisoners, of course advocating for humane treatment was something seen as siding with the enemy.
This book is an account of your ordeal, and it's also a memoir in many ways. As you tell us about your upbringing. So talk please about you. I would say a middle-class upbringing in New Jersey, very much an American story. So why don't you tell us about your family, and you've talked a little bit about your brothers, but talk about them also.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I grew up in Springfield, New Jersey, in a middle-class suburb, and I was raised as a Lutheran, one of the more liturgical Protestant denominations. And in high school, I went through the education system right in Springfield. And in high school, I got involved in a lot of sports activity. I played varsity soccer and also excelled in wrestling, ultimately placing 4th in the state championship during my high school wrestling career.
Rumsfeld was a wrestler, by the way.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it fits with the military.
We should grapple sometime. But that also was of interest when I applied for West Point, and I actually wrestled 4 years at the United States Military Academy.
You were not the first. Were you the first of your family to go to West Point?
I was the first of my family to go to West
and
Point.
then your brother.
My younger brother followed 4 years later.
Well, what was it about the Army that attracted the Yee family, do you think?
I think it was what attracts many people, and that it provides a great opportunity for many people to get involved in leadership and discipline. We know that those who serve in the military are instilled with a sense of self-discipline. But I chose the United States Military Academy at West Point because it was one of the it's a premier institution for developing future leaders of America. And of course, I write about my high school wrestling coach, who often encouraged those who were on the team to go to West Point, and that this was the best place for young men and women to become leaders of this nation.
Are your brothers still in the Army?
Yes, both of my brothers are still in. My youngest brother, he still maintains his reserve commission, and my other brother, Walter, who's a year younger than I am, is an active duty doctor at Fort Lewis.
Yes. Obviously, they were not happy with the way the Army treated you, but they have continued to serve the service, correct?
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
For sure. My whole family is dedicated in many ways to contributing to this country, and not only, of course, was my family, my brothers who serve in the military, upset with how I was treated by the military, but the American public in general, especially the American Muslim community and the Asian American community, the interfaith community, the legal community, of course, were very upset with how I was treated.
Yeah. You become an artillery officer, correct, or a Patriot battery officer?
I was commissioned into the Air Defense Artillery,
yes,
and would join upon being commissioned as a second lieutenant the Air Defense as a Patriot Missiles Fire Control Officer.
And you deployed to Saudi Arabia, correct?
I served in the aftermath of the first Gulf War.
Right.
The war had actually ended by the time I was deployed, but my unit in Germany was the only unit not to deploy during the war, and as such, we were the first to deploy after the war. And at that time, in 1991, there had been some talk that perhaps there would be more ongoing conflict at one point when Saddam Hussein had taken hold of some UN inspectors.
When did you begin to become attracted to Islam as a way of life, of faith?
Right. I started looking into the religion of Islam and studying it shortly after I graduated West Point. After I graduated, I had some friends, and then I found myself involved in some interfaith dialogue, in which myself and some other students were comparing and contrasting religious doctrine. And I had never actually heard about the doctrine of Islam. And initially, because I was raised as a Christian, believing in the doctrine of the Trinity, I rejected it immediately, because this is not what I was brought up, and this is not what I believed. But the challenge was put out to me that how could you judge something without first studying it? And that made sense to me, so I took it upon myself to read a little bit about Islam so I could be better engaged in the dialogue. And it was interesting because I found a lot of things in the religion of Islam that I myself already believed as a Christian. For example, as a Christian, of course, I believed in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ as part of one's salvation. I learned that Muslims also believe in the virgin birth of Christ. I learned that Muslims believe in the second coming of Christ as one of the signs that the day of judgment is nearing. As a Christian, I believe in second coming of Christ, again, as part of your salvation and believing in the Trinity. And then, of course, I would learn about the many biblical prophets as a Christian, those of Abraham, Moses, David, Noah and his ark, who all taught the simple message that God is one. And these biblical prophets are also found within Islam. Again, Muslims believing that these righteous men throughout history taught that simple message along with Jesus, and then Muhammad taught the simple message that God is one. And I became Muslim really on that simple doctrine, the belief in one God.
Was there something there that your Lutheran faith just didn't quite have that you found in Islam? One component, maybe, to put it in that kind of term?
I found the doctrine of Islam very, very simple, where it essentially says that God is one and that throughout history there were a number of prophets or men who were chosen by God to teach that simple message. And this was actually very much a part of Christianity. And it was a simple matter of taking this simple doctrine and separating it from the doctrine of the Trinity, which looks at Jesus as being a divine figure. Okay. But in Islam, he's an incredibly honored person where he taught the people to worship only God. And I believe that.
So you make a big decision in your life. I think I have this correct. You decide to leave the army and study to become a cleric or some type of figure in the Muslim community, and decide to go to Damascus for your training. Is that about right?
Well, what had actually happened while I was in the Gulf, there was an opportunity for me to visit Mecca. And here I am, a new Muslim of only 5 months, and I had learned that there was a program, a joint program sponsored by the American military and the Saudi military for American Muslim soldiers who were serving in the Gulf theater that allowed a short trip to visit Mecca. And I took advantage of this opportunity and made my first trip to Mecca. And here I am, a new Muslim, had converted to Islam solely on this simple basis of doctrine that there's only one God. But in my mind, like many Americans, like many Westerners, my only interaction with other Muslims had been with people of the Arab, Middle Eastern descent, or African American, as I very much found within the American military Muslim community. And in my mind, I thought I would be the only Muslim of Chinese descent going to visit Mecca on that day, but was quite surprised when I came upon the Holy Mosque and saw the vast diversity displayed within the Holy City and within Islam. The first large group of Muslim pilgrims that I saw were maybe from Indonesia or Malaysia, and were very much Asian like myself. And on that trip, I would meet Muslims from Russia, from Europe, from the African continent, of course, Arab Muslims in the Middle East. And I even met Americans who were there studying the religion in the second holy city, Medina. And so as a youngster growing up in social studies class, learning that America is this great country of ethnic diversity, that it's a melting pot for people of all races and colors. This is what was instilled in me as a youngster, and this is what I saw in Islam, and that would inspire me to want to learn more about the religion I had accepted. And at that time, returning back to the base in Saudi Arabia, I also had observed the growing numbers of Muslims in the ranks following the Gulf War, but at that time there were no Muslim chaplains. So my question was, how would Muslims within the military get proper representation if there were no Muslim chaplains? So that idea came to mind then. And
then, when some Americans think of Syria, they think of, it's on the terrorist list that the State Department keep. We consider it a terrorist state sponsor of terrorism. A country that dominates Lebanon, at least at that time. Why did you choose Syria as the place to go for your Islamic education?
One thing, when you look at the politics of the Middle East, it's very interesting because we see, for example, in countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, where they have a more ultra-Orthodox interpretation of Islam. And Saudi Arabia, for example, is often very criticized for human rights abuses or oppressing the women, where they are forced to cover completely in black. They're not allowed to drive. They can't travel without a male family member. So a nation like Saudi Arabia, which has an ultra-Orthodox interpretation of Islam, often criticized for human rights abuses, seemingly is one of the U.S.'s closest allies in the region. But then when we look at Syria, if anyone who's actually studied the country itself, you find that it's a very secular nation, and the government is very keen on ensuring that political interpretations do not seep into the religious curriculum. And we've seen in the past, actually the government in the past has actually been strict on controlling the religious education to ensure that those political interpretations don't seep in to the religious studies. And as a result, you find a more traditional interpretation of Islam, not ultra-Orthodox like we find in Iran or Saudi Arabia, but a more traditional, moderate interpretation. And that would vastly benefit me, especially with my interactions with non-Muslims and being involved in the interfaith movement.
Right. Would you say your training in Syria was that Islam is a religion of peace, that it is a religion of love, and it is not meant to, dominate or conquer the other religions in the world? Was that generally the training?
Right. When you study Islam, you find that even throughout Islamic history, you find a vast amount of tolerance for those of other faiths, particularly those of the Jewish and Christian religions, who are referred to within the Quran as people of the book. And this is a term which is used to distinguish honor of those other religions, not Islam, but Christianity and Judaism hold a special place within Islam and being honored by actually being called people of the book, because we all have roots back to the Prophet Abraham. And this is essentially what the current Hajj, which is going on today, commemorates, that we all have common roots back to the Prophet Abraham, the father of the Abrahamic faiths.
And you meet your wife in Damascus, correct?
I was married in 1998. I married a woman, Palestinian woman, who was born and raised in Damascus, Syria, also a student of the Islamic College.
How did you meet her?
Actually, I met her through the school that I studied at, and I was one of the few Americans who studied there. So the faculty knew me very well, and it turned out that her brother was actually a professor in the Islamic school, so the family knew of me, and it worked out that way.
Now, all this time, what is your reaction from your brothers, your parents, to your conversion to Islam and taking an Islamic wife? What is their reaction?
Well, my family's always been very open-minded and always accepting of each other and of the decisions that we all make. But yet we all support each other. And at first, growing up as a Christian, my mother had thought perhaps I should revisit some of the teachings of Christianity. But actually, in my studies of Islam, I had been revisiting teachings of Christianity and was actually learning more about both religions in the process of converting to Islam. But they were very open and accepting of me converting to Islam. Something also they themselves did not know very much about, and it was also a learning process for them.
Now, then you re-enter the Army, correct?
I came back in the Army in 2001, but this time as a chaplain.
And your goal, were you career-minded at that point? You write in your book that you wanted to become the first Muslim lieutenant colonel chaplain in the Army?
Actually, when I left active duty the first time, I had the idea that perhaps I would be the first Muslim chaplain within the military, because at that time, there were no Muslim chaplains. But when I took that time off and studied Islam traditionally overseas, gaining the insight and the wisdom from traditional Muslim scholars abroad, during that period, several Muslim chaplains came into the ranks in all three of the services, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And so by the time I came back into the ranks, there were already a handful of Muslim chaplains. One had just been promoted, I think, to major. So my goal would then become to maybe one day become the first lieutenant colonel Muslim chaplain, which is the next rank above major.
And you're posted at Fort Lewis in Washington?
My first duty assignment was to Fort Lewis, Washington.
With your wife, is it Huda? Is that how you
Huda, H-U-D-A.
And then you have a daughter.
6. She just turned 6 this past December.
So everything is going according to plan. You can preach at Fort Lewis.
Well, I entered the ranks with the idea that I would be representing Muslims in the military and providing religious accommodations, more so to the Muslim personnel serving within the ranks. But actually in my training I would learn that no, chaplains actually are defenders of the First Amendment right, the free exercise of worship for all individuals within the military, regardless of what the chaplain's denomination is and regardless of what the service members' denomination is. And so we very much take a pro-pluralism outlook within the ranks.
Where were you on September 11th?
On September 11th, I was actually in Washington State, in Olympia, during the time of the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And immediately I knew that, or immediately I feared that there would be backlash from those attacks as I watched them on television on the West Coast. It was still very early in the morning, and feared that the backlash would perhaps result in what we saw after the Oklahoma bombing, where there was backlash against the Muslim community. And there in Oklahoma, of course, there were no Muslims involved in that attack.
Sure. And of course, you didn't really know at that time how much this attack was going to change your life. Not at that time. But before you went to Guantanamo, here we know that detainees are being swooped up in Afghanistan. They're being flown to Gitmo, and they're starting this prison. Did you have at that point an opinion as to whether we as a country were doing the right thing or the wrong thing? What did you think about the initial decision that we have to have a place to keep Al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects?
Yeah, at that point when I was sent down to Guantanamo, I had known about the operation, but I hadn't actually learned much about it in reading about the operation and why specifically Guantanamo Bay was chosen as the location for the prison camp. I was more focused after 9/11 on building bridges of understanding in the post-9/11, in the immediate post-9/11 era. And I was actually called upon by the Pentagon and sometimes by the State Department to give briefings and lectures about Islam and to distinguish Islam from extremism or terrorism. And I did very well, was very effective amongst the troops, and made a difference and was recognized for those contributions. And as a result, I was handpicked to go down and be the chaplain down in Guantanamo.
Yeah, your value, to put it that way, increased dramatically to the military, looking for some sort of outreach, I guess. Mm-hmm. Did you agree with the decision to invade Afghanistan and take down the Taliban, since that seemed to be the base used by the enemy to attack us?
Well, again, at that time, and I'll give you an example, at that time, shortly after we did start dropping bombs on Afghanistan, for example, in South Africa, there is a significant Muslim minority population that was heavily demonstrating against the U.S. Embassy, I believe, in Cape Town. And the State Department actually requested from the Pentagon an idea in which they would put one of the military Muslim chaplains on a panel with the prominent Muslim journalists from South Africa to help try and engage that community and show that right here in America we have Muslims who are actively participating in our country. And I did that. And I was the one who they chose. I was the point man after 9/11. I received most of the major media requests to answer questions about Muslims within the military. And I actually helped relieve a lot of that tension and represented, as it stated on my officer evaluation report at that time, with great distinction, the Muslim issues within the ranks.
Okay. I was just, as a military decision, do you think we should have taken down the Taliban? Was that in your opinion? So people have an insight when they read your book as to sort of where you're coming from and how you think we should wage this war, or even if we should wage this war.
Right.
Do you think we should have taken down? I mean, did you see the Taliban as we did, as a harsh regime that really wasn't representative of Islam and was in fact harboring al-Qaeda, working with al-Qaeda, and needed to be taken down. Did you agree with that?
Right. I had always stated throughout my time in the military and after 9/11 that whoever it was that committed these acts of violence, targeting and killing innocents, were criminals, and that they should be brought to justice. And if it took going into Afghanistan and going into the ranks of the Taliban and al-Qaeda and finding those responsible for 9/11, then of course this is something that I supported. And as a result, we find that people were captured in that conflict.
Sure.
And it wasn't my decision. I had really no involvement in the planning of where they would be located and how they would be sent to Guantanamo or subjected to rendition and all of these other controversial issues that are being brought out today.
All right. And when did you get your orders to, when did you find out you would be the chaplain at Guantanamo Bay?
I think my orders were officially dated September of 2002.
All right, let's hold it right there, and when we come back, we'll talk about your relatively short time at Guantanamo and the events that followed that.
Great.
Okay.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with James Yee and Rowan Scarbourgh in just a moment.
After his defeat in the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt joined 4 others to explore uncharted territory in the Amazon rainforest. Tonight on Book TV, author Candice Millard takes you along to detail what they encountered, including starvation, disease, and murder. Her new book is The River of Doubt. Watch at 11:30 p.m. Eastern. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated April 14, 1865. Monday, 4 Lincoln scholars assessed the murder of America's 16th president. Michael Kaufman, author of American Brutus. James Swanson, author of Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer. Edward Steers, Jr. on The Trial. And Frank Williams, Judging Lincoln. The Lincoln Assassination, Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern on Book TV's 3-day holiday weekend. Taylor Branch is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the 3-volume history of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And live Sunday, February 5th, it's your chance to talk with him in depth. His latest and final volume is At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968. In Depth with Taylor Branch, live Sunday, February 5th, starting at noon Eastern, only on Book TV, only on C-SPAN 2.
Afterwards with James Yee and Rowan Scarbourgh continues.
So you arrive in Guantanamo Bay, and I think everybody would agree that that place was not ready for prime time in 2002 when we began flying in Taliban and al-Qaeda suspects. They were still constructing the cages as those people flew in.
Right, at that time it was Camp X-Ray.
Yes, and really the training was not adequate. We know now that the guards at Abu Ghraib, the guards at Bagram in Afghanistan, and the guards in Guantanamo Bay were not properly trained and perhaps how to interrogate people, how to handle people that were not well versed in Islam enough. And there were problems. And you spend a great deal in your book talking about things you actually saw and the way detainees were treated and things that they told you that you related into the book. So perhaps you could recap generally how you saw the prison run and how you saw the detainees treated.
Yeah, when I first got down there, the operation was sort of in array, and was also in transition because the first command section of the Joint Detention Operations Group, you know, the command that oversaw the detention of the prisoners, was in transition, and I came in at a point of transition. And there weren't really established standard operating procedures at that time. So one of the first tasks that was given to every staff officer was to develop the standard operating procedures for each section, whether it's personnel, security, operations, supply, and then of course my section, the chaplain section. And so it took a lot of time and effort to even just put things in order. But initially being sent down to Guantanamo, I was a little bit unsure of what my role was going to be as the Muslim chaplain, and actually thought that perhaps I was just being sent down so that the U.S. administration, so that the military could say, yes, we do have a Muslim chaplain assigned to this operation, therefore we're being sensitive to the religious needs of the prisoners. But when I got down there, I knew as a chaplain that I'm also a staff officer to the camp commander, that I advise on religious issues, and I was in a role where I could make recommendations. And I immediately proved myself and showed the valuable contributions that I could make by giving an analysis of Islamic culture and how it affects the situation, the detention operation, and it would ultimately help allow that operation to run a lot more smoother. And my supervisors, who I reported to, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Stewart and Colonel Adolph McQueen, who was the commander of the camp, valued my contributions, and it reflected in the officer evaluation report that I received while I was down in Guantanamo. It was the best that I had ever received in the 14 years as a commissioned officer. And then I also made other contributions, like towards public affairs. I was on the media tour weekly and was one of the people selected to interview on a weekly basis with the journalists who came down to visit Guantanamo. And I had General Jeffrey Miller's trust, because everyone who's dealt with military public affairs knows that the military doesn't just put any soldier in front of the camera, but only those who they trust will speak positively about the military. And I was someone who had the trust of the command. So I was making enormous contributions down in Guantanamo, both within the tactical operation and also other parts that were representing the
And when did
military.
you begin to see things the way the detainees were treated that you did not agree with? Was that immediately? Or
almost immediately. But even before going down, I had read some items in the news which were a little bit disturbing. For example, I had learned about how the initial set of guards, who you have mentioned perhaps didn't have the adequate training, would, for example, use their rifles and knock off the turbans that the prisoners would make out of the towels that they were given, so they could pray with a head covering, a prayer cap, so to speak. It was also disturbing that the first doctors that they sent down to Guantanamo were female doctors, and knowing that the prisoners who were captured come from a very conservative Islamic society where there is not much interaction between men and women or people of the opposite sex unless it's their wives or their family members. The first doctors that they sent to conduct the medical exams were female, so it put the prisoners immediately in an uncomfortable position where they had to strip down naked in front of females, and that made them very uncomfortable and it caused some tension. And I read about these things and clearly saw that there was a need for education, Islamic awareness, an understanding of the Islamic culture, because ultimately a lack of that understanding was disrupting the operation. And when I got down there, I saw that it even disrupted the intelligence gathering operation from some of the things that I heard from the prisoners themselves. Some of the tactics that were being used to try and break the prisoners actually turned the prisoners off to the interrogators, and they would come and tell me how they had decided not to speak to the interrogators because of the way they were being treated, or how they felt that the religion of Islam and even the Quran, as we most notably read about in recent past, was mistreated and abused.
And what kind of abuse did you personally witness of the detainees?
Yeah, in terms of physical abuse, one of the things that I did observe on a reoccurring basis, a routine basis, was the actual process of forced cell extractions. And it's referred to down in Guantanamo as IRFing. It's an acronym, IRF, which refers to Immediate Response Force, or some people call it Initial Reaction Force. And this is actually a team of guards, 6 to 8 guards, who for some reason have to forcefully extract the prisoner from his cell, whether it's for the safety or security of that individual or a U.S. service member, or whatever reason, sometimes there is a need to forcefully extract a prisoner from his cell. But what I was observing is that these forced extractions were occurring for what I thought were minor infractions, to frustrate the prisoners and to abuse the prisoners, mistreat them. And this process was a very violent process, in where the 6 to 8 guards would come to a prisoner's cell, line up. They're all dressed in riot gear. They have knee pads, shin guards, chest protectors, helmets, and they have these riot shields. And after the team leader douses the prisoner with pepper spray, he quickly unlocks the door, and the 6, 7 remaining guards rush this prisoner, violently manhandle him to the ground, and secure his hands behind his back, his ankles as well, using these plastic zip ties because it's much more expedient than handcuffs. And then they drag the prisoner out to
Did the
solitary
prisoners ever
confinement.
do anything that required this?
And again, I thought the infractions for which they were being punished for were rather minor. And here's one example that I often talk about, is the styrofoam cup issue. Some prisoners had the privilege of having a styrofoam cup in their cell. But sometimes they ended up with 2 styrofoam cups, one for drinking purposes and one for hygiene purposes, to clean themselves after they use the toilet. Of course, you don't drink from the same cup that you would use for hygiene purposes. So sometimes they ended up with 2. The second cup would be given by some of the guards. But then sometimes when the next shift came on, they would see that second styrofoam cup, and by regulation, technically, only 1 styrofoam cup was allowed. The second styrofoam cup became known as illegal contraband, which carries a number of days in solitary confinement, or in MSU, maximum security unit, which essentially is the solitary confinement cells. The prisoners simply refused to go to solitary confinement simply because they had a second styrofoam cup given by another guard. So they refused to come out of their cells and be punished for that simple offense. So then the IRF team had to be called to violently extract them from the cell. This was happening on a recurring basis.
Now, were you protesting this through whatever chain of command there was, trying to get this up to General Miller, that this wasn't proper, and other things you saw going on? Were you filing complaints or whatever could be done from a chaplain's point of view?
Very much so. I made these issues aware. I don't like to say that I was protesting or complaining. I was doing it within my role as the Muslim chaplain. It was stipulated in the standard operating procedures that my role was to provide observation and recommendations regarding prisoner treatment. And this was so that the chain of command could have that information and use it to make the operation run a lot more smoother. The chaplain is often said to be the eyes and ears of the command, because the chaplain often hears things that never reaches the level of the command. And in that sense, Colonel McQueen used me in that role to get that information. So I was making these issues aware, and many of the things that were happening, they actually implemented me and used me to relieve some of those tensions and solve and resolve some of those problems. Most notably, the Quran desecration incidences and the abuse towards the Holy Quran, when that became a major problem, disrupting the detention operation, disrupting the intelligence gathering operation, they asked me, how can we solve some of these problems? And I actually authored the policy which gave proper guidance to all military personnel on how to properly handle the Quran, and implemented a policy to properly respect the Holy Book, and that relieved a lot of the tension and a lot of the problems that arose out of the desecration of the Quran, and the incidences surrounding the abuses towards the Holy Book were resolved because of my input.
One thing that struck me in the book is that there's no criticism from you about the detainees themselves and the life that they chose. I mean, let's say, many of them, maybe we scooped up some innocence in that, but most of the people were either Al-Qaeda fighting for bin Laden or Taliban fighting for Mullah Omar. And certainly they chose a path in Islam that you didn't agree with. I would think so. Yet in the book, there is no criticism of them as men and the decision that they made that found most of them at Guantanamo Bay. Why not?
Perhaps there are some who were involved with fighting for the Taliban or supported Al-Qaeda, but I didn't address that in the book. One, because I didn't have any specific facts or conversations with these individuals about those things. And why? Because initially when I got down to Guantanamo, I was concerned about what my role was going to be. And I immediately addressed the issue with the legal officer of the Joint Task Force about the role of privileged communication, whether my conversations with these individuals would be kept confidential. A relationship that we find within the attorney-client privilege, that we find within the doctor-patient relationship, a relationship that's found between the clergy-parishioner relationship. So I needed to know whether or not I had that privileged or the prisoners had that privileged communication with me. The legal officer didn't have an answer, queried higher. U.S. Southern Command came back and told the Joint Task Force that no, the prisoners did not have privileged communication. And I interpret this to mean the prisoners did not have a right to privileged communication with the chaplain. So in that aspect, I needed to protect myself because I didn't want to find myself involved in a legal situation where I would have to be testifying for or against the prisoner or having to testify for or against the U.S. government in a war crimes tribunal. So I avoided conversations that dealt with the situation and circumstances surrounding their capture, where they were captured, how they were captured, were they involved in any crimes against the U.S. or any war crimes or in any situation which could incriminate them. I kept my conversations focused on their lives in Guantanamo, not only mainly to protect myself from being embroiled in a war crimes tribunal situation. So I didn't have any direct information regarding who was Taliban, who was not, and if these individuals had chosen that path. But clearly through my conversations with them and through other rumors and talk going around the camp, it was clear that several of them, many of them, were swept up, were innocent. We know that over 180 have been released. Another 75 or so have been repatriated back to other countries of their origin. And we also know about the Uyghur Muslims, those Muslims who were captured and brought to Guantanamo from Western China, who the very review boards that the Pentagon have set up, which themselves have been very criticized for not giving due process, have actually adjudicated these certain individuals not to be enemy combatants, but yet they still haven't been released, fearing that they can't be sent back to China.
And of course, the Pentagon says that about a dozen were found back on the battlefield in Afghanistan over of those released. About a dozen went right back in the battlefield, and they were either killed or recaptured again.
I've read some reports that some had returned to the battlefield, but I think that even those who have been released left with a great amount of anger towards the West and towards America because of the way they were treated down in Guantanamo, because of the lack of due process and not being afforded rights, not being treated as prisoners of war. 2, 3, 4 years being held and caged in Guantanamo under the severest conditions, where they're often earthed and violently beaten, where they saw their religion, their faith being used against them, where they witnessed and heard about the Quran being desecrated, created an enormous amount of anger and anti-American sentiment in these individuals, maybe motivating some of those who have been released to go onto the battlefield. And if they weren't extreme before, perhaps now they have more of an extreme ideology now.
Okay. A couple of passages I caught that I think in a sense sum up your attitude toward the detainees. In one you say, the description of the detainees as hardened terrorists began to be contradicted by the impression I was developing of most of them. Do you think a hardened terrorist has a profile you can tell? Muhammad Atta. Meeting Muhammad Atta, would you think that he's a hardened terrorist?
I've never met Muhammad Atta, but
we know he lived in Florida. We know he lived in America for over a year and seemed to be the a law-abiding immigrant looking for an education, when in fact he was a hardened terrorist. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just wondering how you could make this impression, get this impression from these several hundred people when we know that hardened terrorists can walk into a subway and seem like they're on their commute to work and then blow up and kill 300 people.
Right. I think when we look at that term, what's a hardened terrorist? That person who is willing to target innocent individuals and kill them. I mean, that's how we should look at a hardened terrorist. And that impression was given by the military to all U.S. service members who come down and serve the Joint Task Force, that these individuals were the ones who carried out and planned 9/11. And to me, that didn't add up. I couldn't see that these 660 or so Muslims who were being caged in Guantanamo were the ones who attacked and carried out the planning of 9/11. In my mind, if they were, they wouldn't be in Guantanamo. That they would be in some other, more secure location. And at that time, I had heard about perhaps the hardened terrorists being held in the ships, in the ocean.
Yes, the senior Al-Qaeda people. Not necessarily the foot soldiers, but the senior people.
Or Diego Garcia or something. So in my mind, the hardened terrorists wouldn't be in Guantanamo. They would be in some much more secure location, much more secret location, maybe in one of these secret CIA black sites that we've recently heard about, reported initially by the Washington Post, I believe.
Okay. When did you believe that things started to go bad for you in Guantanamo, and that you became an object of some suspicion?
Actually, before even going down there, I write about in my book, For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire, about how, in my conversations with the previous Muslim chaplains, how there was a strong anti-Muslim hostility in Guantanamo. And it became clear to me when I got down there that that was directed not only towards the prisoners, because of the Muslim faith, but also towards the U.S. Muslim personnel, both military and civilian, who were and are patriotically serving that mission. So I had this idea already, knowledge going down there, that there was anti-Muslim sentiment down in Guantanamo. But I have always been someone who's been very confident in my abilities to effectively communicate with others, especially people not of the Muslim faith, and talk about my faith and my religion in a way that brings people together and builds bridges. And this is what I was recognized for in the days post 9/11, when many Americans, especially within the ranks of the military, had questions about Islam. So I knew going down that there was this type of atmosphere. And throughout actually my time down there, there were people, and from the things going on within the operation, and some of the policies that were made, and some of the abuses that were evident, that there was hostility directed towards myself as a Muslim, mainly from people who didn't work with me. Those who worked close with me in the Joint Detention Operations Group, on the staff, very much trusted my input, my advice, and saw me as someone who was contributing to the operation. Okay. But more so, the intelligence officers in the interrogation and in the intelligence gathering side of the operation, who didn't know me, saw me as the enemy, because their analysis of Islam equaled enemy. I was a Muslim, therefore I must be the enemy. So down in Guantanamo, that was what I was faced with, and I didn't really have much interaction with those people who harbored negative attitudes towards people of diverse faiths.
Yeah. But obviously there was a lot of scrutiny on you by September 2003, because you fly out of Cuba, you think you're going home, and when you land in Jacksonville, Florida, you're arrested. And they fill out a confinement order, and they accuse you of these horrible crimes, spying and aiding the enemy, although they never quite spelled out, who the enemy was.
Right.
And you end up in the brig 76 days in isolation. And it seems like your case is going nowhere. You have two military attorneys, but there's no progress. I mean, either putting you on trial or dropping the charges. Nothing seems to be happening. There seems to be inertia, except that you're kept under harsh conditions, very harsh conditions. But then I think someone who comes across as a hero in the book is Eugene Fidel, a civilian attorney who practices in Washington. And he's the guy, in my opinion, who really got your case exposed to a certain extent and challenged the Army to put up or shut up. How did you find Eugene Fidel, and how important was he to ultimately winning your freedom?
Oh, he was very important, and this is why the concept of due process is so important in our society, and the value that it is towards really upholding the fundamental American principle, the fundamental universal principle of justice. But here I am, I'm coming back into the United States on a short 2-week break. I find myself stopped by customs officials who search my bags, seemingly as if this was something routine, as customs officials normally do when people re-enter into the country. But I was later to learn, disturbingly, that it was actually the FBI who requested the customs officials to single me out, identify Captain James Yee, myself, and then have me searched. So in effect what was happening is this customs official was working as an extension of the law enforcement agency, the FBI, without probable cause, violating my Fourth Amendment constitutional right to be free from an illegal search and seizure. But to me it didn't really matter because I didn't have anything. But then it wouldn't matter because
People said you had the names of detainees.
They would say I had suspicious documents.
Did you have the names of any detainees on you?
Actually, the allegations that were made that I had maps of the base, that I had names of the interrogators, of information about specific interrogation sessions with certain detainees was the claim that was being made, which I never had any of these things.
Did you have anything on you?
I had names of translators who attended my religious service because they were part of my congregation.
Not detainees, but other personnel. But personnel, not detainees.
Most of what I had dealt with personnel. I had phone charts, and I had a stack of documents that related to the country of Syria, which I was using that research that I had taken right off the internet, off of Yahoo search engines, that I was using to prepare my research paper in my course that I was enrolled in Middle Eastern politics. That raised suspicions about me potentially being a spy for maybe the country of Syria, and the FBI agents actually questioned me about these documents and whether or not it's somehow related to, I was related to the government of Syria.
Now the charges are dropped. Eventually the serious charges are dropped, but General Jeffrey Miller, who ran the camp, he still wants to go after you, correct? He wants to get you before him in some non-judicial punishment, and that does happen. But eventually that is overruled by the commander of Southern Command, and you're in a sense exonerated. That General Miller comes off as you know, if Eugene Fidel is the hero, Miller comes off as quite the villain. How did you view the way that he treated you in this case?
For one, I think it's important to point out the trust that I had from General Miller during the operation, because he did trust me to interview with the media on a weekly basis. He actually, down in Guantanamo, gave me 2 officially military awards signed by himself. Most soldiers, when they get deployed, come home with a nice military award thanking them for their service. I had already received 2 official military awards from Major General Miller. And I had been recommended for a 3rd that I was supposed to have received when I completed my year tour. I had received several letters of recognition for other contributions from Major General Jeffrey Miller. So he knew clearly who I was as an officer, as one of his advisors, and the contributions that I was making down in Guantanamo. So it was disturbing to learn how much involved he was in deciding to arrest me, to bring charges against me, and to imprison me. And he would take responsibility for those decisions. Even though the initial article that was written about me being imprisoned from the Washington Times, which you yourself wrote, had stated that the decision to arrest me was made by the highest levels of government, or was made at the highest levels of the government. And to me, Major General Miller, 2-star general, is not the highest level. So I've always questioned on where exactly did my case lie? Did it lie much higher than Major General Jeffrey Miller, who had direct contact with the Pentagon because of his role as the commander of one of the most highly sensitive operations. Was it in the office of the Secretary of Defense or even higher up within the White House and the President? So I've always wondered really who was responsible for making those decisions to arrest me. And I also question this because when I was transferred to the brig in South Carolina, I was effectively treated like an enemy combatant. I was subjected to the same tactics that enemy combatants are subjected to when they're transported to Guantanamo, and that of sensory deprivation. Because I was thrown in the back of this truck with an armed guard. I was shackled in 3 places. I had these blackened out goggles placed over my eyes so I couldn't see anything. I had these heavy industrial earmuffs put on my ears so I couldn't hear anything. I was being treated like an enemy combatant, and that determination can only be made by the President of the United States.
Briefly, have you gotten any type of an apology from the government? And if not, do you want an apology?
I haven't received any apology from the military or the U.S. government. And of course, this is something that I continue to fight for. My family, myself, my supporters, and actually several members in the House and Senate are interested in seeing justice done. Interestingly enough, my case is under investigation by the Department of Defense Inspector General, who agreed in December of 2004 to investigate as to how it was that I, Captain James Yee, was thrown in prison for 76 days, was accused of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, and threatened with the death penalty, and locked away in isolation incommunicado, being involuntarily removed from the operation down in Guantanamo. That's all under investigation, and we're all hoping that the results of that investigation will show that indeed the military made a mistake, the U.S. government made a mistake, that it was a gross miscarriage of justice, and that will lead to what I believe is a very deserving an apology.
Okay, James Yee, former Army chaplain, West Point graduate, thank you very much.